His was the only boat to arrive.
I think maybe it was a cow. I don't know.
There's the thank you letter from Lyndon Johnson.
There was even a monorail at one point to the east of us.
Plus, everybody forgets about pirates.
This is the coolest field trip I have ever been on.
I don't know, but I've been told, keep on dancing, won't ever get old.
Hello, and welcome to the Long Island History Project, the podcast that brings you stories and interviews with people passionate about Long Island history. You can hear them all at longislandhistoryproject.org. My name is Chris Kretz, and I'm your host. And our opening music is courtesy of the Homegrown String Band. I am posting this on March 24th, Monday, March 24th, and happy to say this is also a book launch party interview. Tomorrow, March 25th, marks the release of Isle of Ever. It's a story steeped in Long Island history, written by a Long Island native, aimed at a younger audience, but suitable for all ages. So just think back to your own summer experiences, those long, lazy days when you got tired of playing outside, came in, sat down with whatever book you were absorbed in at the moment. We all had our favorite. I was a Hardy Boys, and then Harriet the Spy, and graduating into Lord of the Rings eventually. But if you love reading, if you love learning about Long Island history, then you're going to love today's very special guest.
Hi, I'm Jen Calonita, author of the new book, Isle of Ever.
Jen, thank you for joining us tonight. Appreciate it. I finished the book yesterday. It was very good.
Thank you.
I'll let you guide me in terms of how much you want to relay about it, because it is, in a way, a mystery. But I wanted to start with your history, if we go back a little. And if my research is right, you grew up in Merrick?
I grew up in Carle Place, and I live in Merrick currently.
Gotcha. So let's go to Carle Place. What did young Jen notice about Carle Place? Like when you think back to your childhood there, what images, what places stand out to you?
I mean, well, first of all, I had no idea what a bubble it was. Carle Place is 1 square mile wide, and it has two elementary schools, a K-2, a 3-6, and then the middle school and high school are one building. And I graduated with 100 kids. It wasn't until I got to college that I realized how small it actually was.
I guess my ulterior motive was, did you have a sense of history back then, or were you curious about the history of the things you were seeing, or did people ever relate to you, the history of the town, or?
Not of the town, I'll be honest. My maternal grandmother liked to say that we had a long family tree. She liked to talk about it. She liked to talk about how we were one step away from being one of the daughters of the American Revolution, because on our family tree is Nathaniel Greene, who was a general for George Washington, but she never went forward with any of the paperwork. But I have the family tree paperwork and burial plots and things like that. So my grandmother liked to talk about history. She lived in Mineola, but my parents didn't talk about it so much.
And you went on to become a writer. What? And I'm sure you've gotten this question a lot.
No.
Where do you trace the spark of that to, the drive or the desire to be a writer?
Well, when I was in Carle Place, we actually had an author named Stephen Kellogg visit the school when I was in elementary school. And my parents bought me a book, and I got to wait online and have him sign it. And I think that was the first time I ever realized that this little hobby of mine, writing, was actually a job some people had for a living. He was the first author I ever met. And then when everybody realized I had an interest in writing, my grandparents really tried to indulge it. And both my grandmothers really encouraged it, especially when my grandmother, who had the house in Mattituck, would take me around to local book signings. You know, there was a tiny bookstore in Mattituck when I was younger, and I don't recall the name, but they had a lot of local authors come. And my grandmother would always bring me, whether I was interested in whatever they were talking about or not. She wanted me to see other authors in the world.
That's very good. And so as a future middle grade YA author, what books did you gravitate to? What books are in your YA Hall of Fame from when growing up?
So it drove my parents a little bit batty because we spent a lot of our summer in Mattituck at my grandparents' house. They lived 2 blocks from the beach. And I did not love the Long Island Sound. It was rocky,
Mm.
there was a ton of seaweed. And so I would spend my days sitting under an umbrella reading. And that was when Francine Pascal's Sweet Valley High was very big. There was probably over 200 books at that point, and I was going through a book a day. So we'd have to go into town every few days to get me more books. And then eventually they realized I needed to go to the library because I was just flying through the book so much.
Hmm.
Those were my favorites.
So explain more. The Mattituck and the North Shore connection will lead us into Isle of Ever. So you were spending time, was that every summer usually, or?
Yes, my grandparents, I don't know how they discovered Mattituck because my grandparents lived in Mineola, but in 1970 they bought, well, 1967 they bought property in Mattituck right off the Long Island Sound, top of a hill, 2 blocks off the Sound, near Captain Kidd Drive. And they built this house, and it became the focal point of the family, where every weekend everybody would spend the weekend out there. And we were the only grandchildren. My dad is the oldest of 3 boys, and I basically spent my whole summer out there every summer, or a lot of it. So it was my 1970s, my 1980s. That's really where I grew up in the summers.
How is it much different from today, or how do you see it? Has it changed over time?
My grandparents are no longer with us, and they left the house to my parents. And so my parents have definitely done some updates, and there's definitely some way bigger houses around their house now. But for the most part, the area looks exactly the same to me. The beach looks the same. I know some of the people on the walk up and down the hill to the beach. I will say things are a lot more, they're busier out there. Like it used to be, you'd get off the LIE in Riverhead, and there was really nothing there. And then the outlets came about. And then I remember if you wanted to do any major shopping, you had to go all the way back to Riverhead. Now I feel like even though the North Fork is still the big box stores, I would say, are in Riverhead, there's a lot more options out there than there was when we were little. When we were little, it was basically beach or you were in the house. There was like one mini golf, or, we would go to Greenport. But when I was little, the carousel wasn't even there yet. So it was very different. So I had a very big imagination, and I think that served me well as an author because it's inspired so many stories.
Well, and just that you lived on, what was it, Captain Kidd Street or Drive?
It was right by Captain Kidd Drive. That block is still there, and talk of pirates was big in that house.
So can you encapsulate what the rumor or what Captain Kidd's connection to Long Island is, or what you heard?
Yes. So, as a kid, I always tell kids when I go to schools and I visit, we didn't have video games. I didn't have cable. Like it was basic TV out there. And when I would get bored, as I routinely would, my grandmother would say, you should go down to the beach and really dig for treasure. And I would always say, well, why? And she said, it's rumored that some of Captain Kidd's treasure was never found. And she didn't really explain it to me at first, but I used to ask a lot of questions about it. And eventually she explained that Captain Kidd did sail the waters around Long Island, that he had actually stopped on Gardiner's Island and asked Mr. Gardiner to bury his treasure and not tell him where it was, so that I guess if he was ever captured, he wouldn't know where the treasure was. And then he sailed away. And while it was always said that the treasure was found, there were long rumors that maybe some of the treasure wasn't on Gardiner's Island. Maybe some had yet to be found. And our home was near an area that had been undeveloped. And my grandparents would always say, maybe it's down there. Maybe it's on the beach. Maybe it's down there. And so I would lie awake at night in this house without air conditioning under like a tiny fan, and I couldn't sleep, and I'd probably be sunburned, and I would think, why has no one found the rest of the treasure? If there is more treasure out there, where is it, and why has no one found it? And I find a lot of my ideas come from things I experienced as a kid. So with this, a few years ago, when I wanted to tie into Long Island more in a story, I thought maybe the treasure that hadn't been discovered was somewhere we couldn't see, that possibly it was on an island that didn't exist on any maps. And maybe it only appeared during certain conditions every few hundred years. And that's really how the story started to take shape. And I wanted to pull in real places in Greenport and Mattituck and things on the North Fork, but also create this like fantastical world and new characters. And I knew I wasn't going to use Captain Kidd, but I have a pirate named Captain Kimball. So I do little nods where I can.
No, it's great. And just, looking at the map of that area, you've got Gardner's Island, Shelter Island, Robbins Island, like there's a whole archipelago between the
Yes.
forks there that you could set a lot of stories, I would imagine.
Yes, and that was my whole thought. I thought, a lot of kids don't know about Gardiner's Island, how it's one of the oldest privately owned islands in the country. And so I started researching Gardiner's Island at first. And there is, I believe it's the Peconic Times, is a smaller, or the Suffolk Times. My parents would get all these newspapers out there. And when I started researching this book several years ago, even though I knew it was going to be fiction, every time my parents would get one of their weekly magazines or Hampton magazine or something, if something related to what I was working on, they would cut out the article. And there was an article about Gardiner's Island and Captain Kidd that really made me think, well, if you were going to have like a mysterious island, nestled between the two forks would be the place to have it. And so the story sort of grew from there. And my parents, I think, are disappointed I didn't make Mattituck the basis, for the story where it takes place. But in my mind, I really wanted it to be I just kept thinking about Greenport because we always visited Greenport as a kid, and I've brought my kids there. And I wanted this sort of fishing town with history that could develop over time. And Greenport always felt like that to me because there are still so many places in Greenport you can visit where they have turned them into museums, but you can visit the old blacksmith shop. You can visit, while you can't go inside, the schoolhouse is there, one of the original schoolhouses. There's the historical society. And in my head, the story kind of built up around Greenport, even though our home was in Mattituck.
Sure. And for context, a couple of summers in a row, I had to drop my kids off at the ferry for a camp, and we would always stop in Greenport on the way back or on the way there.
Yeah.
So I've strolled through that. There used to be a great bookstore. I don't know if it's still there, right near the end of the docks, just like a hole in the wall kind of bookstore.
There is still a bookstore there, but I don't know if it's the same one. But there is one there. I actually popped in last summer and they didn't know my books. But I was like, listen, my book next year is set in Greenport. And they were like, oh, okay. But I do plan on going into the shop with the book. And my publisher made this beautiful map of the East End, but that has locations from the book in it. And I plan on dropping off a copy. I feel like my grandparents would want me to do that. So.
Yeah, and so just to whet the appetite, because I think you changed some names, but what are give us some highlights of Greenport that you mentioned that are part of the book or the plot?
Well, I changed some of the names, like the Historical Society. I changed the name of the Historical Society. But, I think it was last summer, I went out there and it's the Bug Light Lighthouse, which is an offshore, for those who don't know, this lighthouse isn't on land like the Orient Point Lighthouse or the Montauk Lighthouse. This one you have to take a boat to. And so I took the tour last summer, and it's, you're waiting in this very, very tiny little museum. And so I tried to add key details from that. And I took the tour to the lighthouse, and I took notes. And, that was a lot of fun to do, just talking about the main area of the town. I was thinking of Preston's, which has been there since the 1800s, very, very old storefront. There's also Claudio's restaurant, which I don't name by names, but if you go into Claudio's and you go behind the bar, they actually do have a hidden door, like I guess like a trap door down to like an underground area, which was used during the Prohibition. And that plays into my story in Isle of Ever as well. So I tried to pull details where I could and then make them my own since I was doing a fictional story. And that was just a lot of fun, just to think of all the places I'd been, how many times I'd been in that Five and Dime and down the main street, and how much had changed even since I was a kid. So I could only imagine how much it changed from the 1800s.
And I don't think this, you mentioned the carousel, and just as I was catching up on the history, I don't know if you ran across this, but apparently they're not quite sure where it came from. The Grumman Company was using it in the 50s and then gave it to the town. But before that, they think it was part of a traveling circus, but I guess there's not clear documentation.
Interesting, because for some reason, I think my parents didn't know either. So when I was little, or when my kids were little, we would always say, "Oh, it came from like Brooklyn or something like
Yeah,
that,"
could have,
and they
probably.
brought it out here to preserve it. But I
Hmm.
mean, we spent every weekend at that carousel, and my kids love to. With that carousel, it's fun for the kids because there's rings that come
Yep.
down, and there's the gold ring, and if you get the gold ring, then you get a free ride. So that became like a big game with my own children.
So Isle of Ever, talk about it in relation to how does it fall within what you have been writing, and then also, is it YA? MG was not a term I had known, but is it middle school, or as you were writing it, what were you aiming for?
So it's considered middle grade, and middle grade is elementary age. So I say the sweet spot for a story like this would be anywhere between fourth grade and eighth or ninth grade, depending on, someone's reading level. I do say as an adult, I love to read a younger story like this, so I wouldn't say adults wouldn't enjoy it. It's an adventure mystery, and the premise behind the book is this girl finds out she will collect a huge fortune if she plays a game to find an island that doesn't exist on any maps. She only has 2 weeks to find it. And as she starts to piece together clues from an ancient diary from one of her ancestors in 1825, she starts to realize there's more than just finding a missing island at stake. A group of kids went missing in 1825 during something called a blood orange moon. They haven't been seen since. There's rumors of this immortal pirate who has been not haunting, but kind of hanging around Greenport since the 1600s. And there just might be a cursed pirate treasure. And this is the kickoff to what is meant to be a trilogy. And this is book one. So there's a bit of a cliffhanger ending. But I feel like I give you enough that you know where we're going next.
No, it's interesting. Like I said, I actually finished this yesterday, and I guess I didn't know, or I hadn't assumed that it was a trilogy. So I got to the end, and I don't know if you watch The Amazing Race, but it's that feeling when you get to the end of an episode and they say, "You're still racing." I said, oh my God.
You're so easy. And that's why I begged. I said, please, 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 can we put a note in the back that says, Benny and her friends will return in book two? Because, I always, especially when you're watching a TV show, even, I feel like when you get to the end of the season and you don't know everything, I think, oh, is it being renewed? So I wanted readers to know that another one was coming.
And so you mentioned you're on the island. So what is your plan for the initial launch? Are you getting out there? Are you have any special events we can plug for you?
I wish I could say yes. We don't have any public events for this one right now. I'm doing like a month-long school visit tour. And what's really fun is I was in Texas last week. I was in Dallas. And for those of us who live on Long Island or live in the tri-state area, we know exactly what Long Island is. And then you go to Texas and you meet these kids who are like, "Where is Long Island? What is Long Island?" And I realized quickly I had to include a map of Long Island in my presentations so that kids elsewhere would understand what I meant by two forks. That, it almost looked like a fish in a way. I was trying to describe it to them. So they could understand where this hidden island could be. And, I talked to them a lot about my family history and how it ties into the book as well. So in the book, the character comes from a long line of Evelyns. And my grandmother's name was Evelyn. My mom's name was Evelyn. My middle name is Lynn. And so, like, it became this thing in the family, like how many Lynns there were or Evelyns. And so, my character comes from a long line of Evelyns. That's part of the rules of the inheritance. And then there are characters in the book named the Terrys and the Rudds. And that is very much because my maternal grandmother, while the house in Mattituck wasn't hers, my paternal grandmother used to let my other grandparents come visit. And when they would visit, they would drive us all around the east end of Long Island because my grandmother was very proud that the Terrys and the Rudds were some of the oldest families to settle in Southold. So she would drag me through old cemeteries and make me look at signs and buildings where I would find the family names. So again, all fictional stories, but I love to pull in any kind of family connection when I can. So I feel like this book is really a love letter to both my sets of grandparents. It's dedicated to one set, and the other, their names feature heavily.
That's great. And I can see it inspiring people to check out their own genealogies and start asking some questions of their grandparents to find out these stories in their own
Yeah.
lives.
I wish they were all still here so I could even ask more questions about all of this. There was so much I would have asked while working on this book if they were here to ask.
I have a stray question on writing, whether
Yeah.
it resonates or not. So you pretty much, just looking through your bibliography, you've been writing YA in this level for a while. As you go through the plot and thinking through the story, what's the threshold or what's the decision making in terms of what kind of detail or what type of, how to write about things? Like what makes it YA as opposed to what goes too far and tips over into maybe an older grade category?
Right. So the difference really between middle grade and young adult books are technically considered more middle school, high school. A middle grade is considered more elementary age. But those are all very loose terms because I will say that there's a lot of young adult that's out there now that feels almost adult. It is so detailed, it is so long, it is so dense. I always say the content, the storylines, if it's more of an adult storyline and adult content, and the length for YA is much longer than middle grade. A lot of middle grades might be a little bit shorter than Isle of Ever. So that's why, even though a lot of elementary age readers could be second or third grade, I always say fourth grade and up just because it's a longer story. But if parents have a strong reader, I don't think there's anything inappropriate in Isle of Ever that I wouldn't think an elementary age reader could handle. There's definitely, as you know, without giving anything away, there is this cursed pirate treasure that acts as if it's a fountain of youth, and that kind of is nods to a book called Tuck Everlasting. Just the idea: would you want to live forever if you could? Why or why not? So there's definitely that storyline in here. But I think what makes it middle grade is all the characters are middle grade, the content in it is very middle grade, and I think they could handle it.
And so, not to put you on the spot, but is when when would you expect the next one to be out, or are you where are you in terms of the rest of the trilogy?
I would say I'm 96% done with book 2. I just handed it back in, and I think I get to read it one more time before that goes off to get printed. So I'm about to start writing book 3, believe it or not. Book 2 will come out next March, with the plan to be book 3 coming out the March after that.
And so, just to wrap up, are there any questions I haven't asked you, or anything else you want to get across about the book or the history of it?
No, I feel like you asked everything. I so appreciate you reading it.
Oh, sure. Like I said, it was great. My wife's a high school librarian, so she's usually reading YA, and I got to expose her to this one, so now she'll be reading it next.
Oh, I hope she likes it.
And thank you again to Jen, and congratulations. We're a day away, but happy book launch, happy book birthday day, happy book day, however they call it in the industry. You will find links in our show notes. That's at longislandhistoryproject.org. Ways to find the book, ways to find Jen, and a little more resources for Greenport and related histories. I will point out, unfortunately, the Greenport carousel is currently closed for repairs, but hopefully that'll be up and running soon enough. And that will do it for this episode. Our outro music is Capering by the Blue Dot Sessions, used under an Attribution 4.0 international license. And as always, thank you for listening.